Good morning, everybody, and welcome. We're extremely happy to welcome today Rabbi Benjamin Spratt, who is a respected and popular speaker at our center, and still remembered as a very engaging panelist at our two interfaith conferences a few years back. Rabbi Spratt serves as the senior rabbi of Congregation Rodef Shalom, which is close by here on West 83rd Street. Born in Salt Lake City, Utah, Rabbi Spratt spent his early years exploring his Jewish identity. His journey took him through the conservative, renewal, Orthodox, and Reconstructionist worlds of Judaism before finding a home with the Reform movement. He graduated magna cum laude in 2001 from the Honors College of the University of Oregon as a member of Phi Beta Kappa with a BA in Psychology and Religious Studies. He earned distinguished honors for his thesis on early Jewish mysticism. He was ordained by the Jewish Theological Seminary of America in May 2008, concentrating in Jewish philosophy. In his years at the seminary, the rabbi was the recipient of many awards and prizes in Talmud, philosophy, homiletics, and the Bible. He centers his rabbinate on the values of connection, collaboration, and belonging. Rabbi Spratt has also served as a religious teacher, a religious school director, and a chaplain at Lenox Hill Hospital and Bellevue Hospital here in Manhattan. His highly reviewed book, Awakenings, American Jewish Transformations in Identity, Leadership, and Belonging, was published in 2022. The subject of his talk today is Jewish Tools to Face Times of Fracture. Rabbi, it's been too long.
Thank you so much, Diane, and such an honor to be back here at the Vedanta Society to be with you all. And this is obviously a time when many of us are looking out at the world and seeing a world that seems to be coming apart. We see the rise of nationalism and isolationism in almost every country around the world. We get to see the fears about world war breaking out again. That even as right now there's a great deal of attention on the war between Ukraine and Russia and the war between Israel and Hamas, there are an additional almost 24 wars taking place around the world. And for many of us, we look out at this world in this time of fracture, this time where so many people are pulling apart, and it raises the questions of how do we respond to this time? What are the tools we can bring forward? And so I thought it would be helpful today to bring forward some of the Jewish tools that I'm sitting in right now. And the invitation will be also that maybe you can share with me some of the tools that you are also finding in your own lives. And I wanted to start, and I'm going to try to structure this talk in 3 parts. I'm going to start with the tools surrounding stories. I'm going to continue then in the tools that surround gratitude, and conclude with the tools that surround hope. And feel free to interrupt me along the way if I say anything that feels confusing. If there's any questions you have or comments you want, please don't feel like you have to hold to the end. I will make sure that I budget my time so that we have some question and answer time distinctly at the end. So I wanted to start with the stories we choose to tell. Because right now it's very easy to tell the story that everything is nosediving. It's very, very easy to tell that story. And we happen to have devices that many of us have in our pockets. We have media outlets that are motivated to try to get us to feel a sense of fear and anger because it motivates us to click on those articles to help provide advertising dollars to companies, and we are, every one of us, being manipulated in many ways to try to see that the fractures of this world is the only story to be told. But there are larger stories to be told right now. And if we look at the longer arc of history, we will see that there is less poverty around the world today. There's less famine. There's less hunger around the world today. There's less disease around the world today. And actually, there are fewer deaths related to human violence today than at any other point in history. That is not what you read when you open the headlines of any major media outlet. And so it's important to bring skepticism to the stories that we receive and to think about what are the stories that are not being told. So I wanted to go back to one of the most misunderstood stories, at least in Western religious traditions, and that is the story of the Garden of Eden. So we go back to the Bible, and in Christianity and in Judaism and in Islam, especially looking back to that origin story of the Garden of Eden, it is often understood to be that human choice resulted in being expelled from the Garden of Eden, a place of paradise, because of sinful behavior, because of disobedience. But if one opens the Bible, and feel free to read any translation you wish, you'll find that it's actually a very different story than the one we often inherit. Just to give a little reminder for those of you who aren't familiar with the story, the idea is that we have humanity that's living in paradise. They are told, feel free to live in this paradise. Just whatever you do, do not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And God says, for if you do, you will die. A snake comes along and says to Eve, says to the first woman, you know what? I think that maybe that was a little extreme what God said. You know what? You should eat from the tree. It's going to be wonderful. You're not going to die, I promise. Eventually, Eve says, okay, eats from the tree, offers the fruits to Adam, and Adam eats. And it turns out that God lied, or God was wrong, because they didn't die. The snake actually was telling the truth. The snake was true. And what's interesting is the people are indeed punished. The pain in childbirth, so according to the Bible, and the difficulty in growing crops is the result of disobeying God's injunction not to eat from the tree of knowledge. But that's not why they're kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And if you go and read in the Bible itself, God says, if they have eaten from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, then if they were to go and eat from another special tree, the tree of life, and gain immortality, then they would fully be like us. They would be divine. And so God kicks them out of the garden to stop them from that final step of being truly gods in the world. And what's interesting in this most misunderstood story, which is often told as a story of original sin, that humanity is born into debasement, we are horrific beings. We are sinful beings. We are beings that were born out of sin, born into sin, and all we can do is perpetuate that sin. Or do we tell the story that we have the capacity to understand goodness in this world? That the one thing that separates us from divinity is the fact that we are mortal. And if we were to imagine that there's divinity in every one of us, what does that mean about the value of our own life, the value of the lives of people around us? And so to bring another story to the fore, and this is also another biblical story that is often misunderstood, is a story of the Tower of Babel. Generations after living in the Garden of Eden, humanity is all living in one place and are working together to build a great building project, a great city, a great tower. And at some point, God looks down and sees this tower and decides to destroy the tower, scatter the people all over the world, and confound their languages so that they cannot speak together. And this is also a very often misunderstood story. It's often told as a story of human hubris, that humanity was building this tower to reach the heavens and to go and conquer the realm of God. But that's not actually what's in the story. I encourage you to go and read it if you'd like. The story is this. God looks down and says, if this is what humanity can do when they're speaking one language and working together, then nothing is beyond their reach. Therefore, let's confound their language. Let us scatter them across the world so they cannot hold such potency. Again, the way that we often colloquially tell the story is one that suggests that there was something wrong with us working together, that God's desire was actually to scatter us in order to keep us humble. But the original story actually is the exact opposite, that says we are incredibly potent when we are working together, that we hold the capacity that when we can find the bridges of language, when we can share together in a constructive building project, that nothing is beyond our reach. And I wonder for a moment what it would be to reclaim that story, to see that now we are scattered, yes, around the world, and now there are many languages. But what if we reminded ourselves of what it is when we come together? That even God recognizes that we are an indomitable force when we are willing to bridge and share the desire to build something better. Which leads me into a next story. And this is going to be a story, a tool that I find to be deeply helpful for me in my life, and perhaps it will be for you as well. So this is a story of a rabbi and his son. And this goes back to the Talmud, going back about 1,600 years. And the two of them flee Jerusalem that was being destroyed 2,000 years ago. And they find themselves hiding out in a cave. And they sit there in the cave and they start to learn the mystical lore of Judaism. Some say, the legend has it, this is where the Zohar, the great work of Jewish Kabbalah, gets written. And they spend years studying in this cave, learning the secrets of God. And they walk outside of the cave and they gaze out into the world and they see the horror of humanity, people doing the worst acts in the world. And they've gained such mystical potency that they, with their eyes, have the capacity with their own gaze to actually incinerate anyone that they see who's doing poor behavior. And so they go around the world, burning people up with their eyes, seeing the horrors of people and deciding to decimate them wherever they go. And God calls out and says, "For this reason you have learned the secrets of my teachings. This is the antithesis of what you're supposed to be doing. Go back into the cave and learn." And so the rabbi and his son, they go back into the cave and they learn. And when they are ready, God says, "Emerge from the cave." And so they do. And the father has learned that the purpose of the truth is not to incinerate, but to bring together. But his son failed to understand that truth. And so his son Eliezer continues to use his eyes to burn the people around him, while his father uses his spiritual potency to heal the destruction his son renders. I love this story because many of us at a time of fracture look out and see people making choices that we believe are wrong, that are destructive to the world, that are sinful. And if we had those laser eyes, we would go and incinerate them because we know we've got the truth and we know that some of these people just need to be destroyed. And I love this story because it's suggesting that the moment we think we hold the truth and that we should be burning with judgment the people around us, we should know we have lost the real essence of that truth. And that it is the desire to see truth and knowledge, to heal, to bring together. That is the essence of the divine story. And so that, I think, is a helpful story for me at a time of fracture, of thinking about how do I curate the stories that I'm hearing, but how do I choose the stories that suggest we have a purpose here, we have a potency here, and that potency is dependent actually on us coming together, that potency is dependent on our willingness to use truth to connect and to heal rather than to destroy and to judge. So I want to take that and move us then into some tools of gratitude. So in Judaism, the first words that are supposed to be on our lips when we wake up in the morning are words of gratitude. The words are, Modeh ani lefanecha, thank you, God, for giving me back my soul. That the moment that we wake up in the morning, the first thing we're supposed to say is, thank you for this day. Now, I don't know about you, but my natural state of being when I wake up in the morning is usually not to offer gratitude for my soul. It's usually wondering when I'm going to get some food to eat, or dreading my day, or looking at my phone and experiencing the news and what horrors have happened overnight. But the ideal is supposed to be starting with gratitude. And what's interesting is it's a gratitude that compels responsibility. Many of you are familiar with the realm of psychology, where until about 30 years ago, most of psychology was focused on what goes wrong in the human psyche. So we got lots of great understandings of what can go wrong in our own sense of mental and emotional well-being. But about 30 years ago, there was the bloom of positive psychology, asking the other question of, okay, now that we maybe understand what can go wrong, what are the tools, what is the secret of how things can go right? And so what's interesting about positive psychology is there's been a lot that's been explored asking, how do we get to a better level of satisfaction in life? And as some of you may know, if you've ever had a moment where you're dissatisfied with life, our inclination often is to go and turn things upside down, to go and move to another place, to quit our job and take up a new career, to divorce our partner, to get a makeover. There's 1,000 things that we'll do to try to find a sense of satisfaction in life. And so far, through positive psychology, what's been shown is the most effective way to have greater level of satisfaction in life is to spend 5 minutes every day sitting in gratitude. One of the famous studies was there were 3 groups of people that were created. One group was asked at the end of every day to journal for 5 minutes about things that they're grateful for in their life. The second sample group were asked to journal for 5 minutes about the things that went wrong in their day. And the third group was forced to journal about anything they wanted. The last 2 groups, those forced to focus on what's wrong in life or whatever they wanted to in life, experienced no change. But after 30 days, the first group that spent 5 minutes a day on gratitude had lowered their blood pressure, voiced that they had a deeper sense of feelings of friendship and connection in the world, and a greater level of satisfaction in their life. And I love this idea of, could we start every day before we get to the headlines, before we get to our own loneliness, before we get to all the things that are wrong in my life and the world around us, if we started with gratitude and had the frame of believing that by waking up in the morning, we are being given a gift, and that gift comes with responsibility, that there is perhaps this story of purpose behind it, which raises the question, if we started our day with gratitude, then we get to spend that day wondering, why was I given this day? And imagine the attunement that comes if we believe that in every moment of that day there is some crossroads, some opportunity, some moment, some interaction, some person, some choice that gives the capacity to realize that opportunity before us. Which unfolds into, in Jewish tradition, we are supposed to say 100 blessings a day. A blessing in Judaism is nothing more than a mindful moment of gratitude. Imagine 100 times a day saying thank you for what's right in front of you. I happen to be a person who's naturally wired towards, I would say, angst and complaint. I am really, really good at that. If you're ever having a day where you're struggling to find complaint, just call me up. I'm happy to help you with it. It's amazing to imagine what it would be if 100 times a day we stopped for a moment about wishing and wondering what ought to be and just looked in front of us and thought, this is a blessing. I want to offer gratitude for this. And in Judaism, there is a blessing for everything. There's a blessing for a blooming flower. There's a blessing for seeing the ocean. There's a blessing for when it rains. There's a blessing when you see a really beautiful person. There's a blessing when you see a gathering of 10,000 people together. There's a blessing when you hear good news. There's a blessing when you hear bad news. There's a blessing for everything, but it's not about the blessing. It's not about the words. The words are just a tool to get us to pay attention to what's right in front of us, to start the day with gratitude, but throughout the day have these little moments, micro moments of gratitude. Which leads into another story. So this is a parable that goes back 1,500 years. The rabbi says this is the world as it ought to be. A man brings 2 boats out into the middle of a lake, and he ties the 2 boats together. And on the shared deck of those 2 boats tied together, he builds a palace. So long as the 2 boats are tied together, the palace stands strong. But the moment the boats are cut, the cords severed, and the boats float apart, the palace collapses. The great building project in this world depends on our willingness to tie our boats together. And that means if we want to build a palace, we'll never be able to do it alone. And we will have to do it with a willingness to lose some sense of our own independence for the sake of a collective. And it's interesting because gratitude is a necessary component in this. If I actually attune myself with gratitude for the blessings that are right here, right now, it also allows me to have gratitude for the capacity of the people around me. For any of us who have had the experiment of what it is to be in community, we know that it can be wonderful, and it can also be deeply frustrating. It can be wonderful to realize that we're not alone in this world, that we get to look around this room and feel that there are others that are moving with us, that are struggling with the same questions as us, that when we go through a difficult time in our life, we know that there'll be people to catch us. But it also means at times that the community will move in a direction that we don't like, that there will be times when somebody else's needs take precedence over our own, when we are forced to show up for another person before they are there to show up for us. There'll be times when we in community are encountering a frustrating individual that we think saps all the energy away from the very thing that we want. But what's interesting about gratitude is it opens the capacity to see and offer, if I can find blessing in this moment, maybe I can go and find gratitude for the person who's in front of me. Maybe even in the pain and struggle at times in binding my ship to another and the loss of freedom that sometimes comes with that, I also can have gratitude for the belief that we could be building something greater and grander. And I think that leads into another aspect of gratitude that I think is really important, which is that gratitude propels responsibility. In Judaism, we start every day with gratitude because it then becomes our obligation to inspire such gratitude in others. When we receive blessing, it is our obligation to give those blessings to others. And that means that when we look at some of the research that's out there, we find actually that as people's wealth increases, their generosity decreases. It's a fascinating concept, especially here in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, where there's a great deal of privilege and wealth. It is important to know that, in general, the wealthier people get, the less willing they are to share that wealth with others, which raises a question, why would that be? And one of the greatest correlations that's been out there from positive psychology is that as people find more and more in their life, it becomes harder and harder to feel grateful for it. Some of us know this in our life. We remember when we were children and the wonder we would have when we saw something as simple as a beautiful leaf in autumn from a tree. It could just dazzle us. I remember a number of years ago, my daughter, when I was walking her to school here on the Upper West Side, she would constantly tug on my hand and yank my hand to stop because she would see some beautiful little leaf on the sidewalk. The wonder of being able to see a single leaf, the gratitude and awe she felt, it's something that in adulthood we often lose. And when we start to amass cars and clothing, and we could buy any food we want and go to any restaurant we want, we lose the sense of wonder, we lose the sense of awe, we lose the sense of how magnificent and precious is this one little leaf in front of us. Which means we have to cultivate gratitude, whether we are a person with many means, much means, or with little means. Because if we lose sight of the gratitude, then we also lose sight of the responsibility for that gratitude to inspire generosity. And ultimately, if we go back to that image of the palace building, it is only when we bind our boats together that we can actually engage in building a palace. And if we allow ourselves over the course of our lives with more and more abundance and blessing coming on ourselves, that we are less and less willing to be tied to the people around us and less willing to be generous, then ironically, with more and more potency and power and resource to be able to build a palace, we become less capable of being able to do it. Because no matter how rich you are, you can't build a palace alone. The greatest palace only comes when we do it together. And so it is in nurturing our gratitude. It is in saying 100 times a day, right here, right now, there's blessing. That is the only way that we open ourselves up to be able to share our blessings with others and to allow ourselves to feel the potency of being woven together. which moves me into some of the Jewish tools of hope. So to share another story. This is a story that goes back, legend has it, almost 2,000 years. So there was a group of rabbis living in Babylonia about 1,800 years ago. And they decided in exile, in the diaspora, that they were going to journey back to the land of Israel. And they were going to go back to the very source point of their tradition. And so these rabbis travel back, and they stand in the hills overlooking Jerusalem. And they see the ruins of where the temple in Jerusalem once stood, the place that used to be the center point of Judaism, the place where God was supposedly sitting and dwelling. And they see the rubble and the ruins of that temple. And the rabbis begin to wail. They begin to cry and weep. They see that a fox has made a den, a burrow, in the place where the Holy of Holies once stood, the innermost sanctum of the temple where the Ark of the Covenant was once used to rest. And they see that the holiest place has been debased by a lowly animal. And they scream and cry, how could this have happened? How could our world have come apart? How could things be so terrible? And one of the rabbis, Rabbi Akiva, he starts to laugh. And the other rabbis say, how can you possibly be laughing? Look how terrible this is. How could you be laughing when there's such destruction in front of us, when we have fallen so far from what it ought to be in this world? And Rabbi Akiva said, don't you realize? We always knew the walls of that temple was going to come down. We always knew that the temple was one day going to be destroyed. And now that we come back here and see that that has actually happened, it also means that we are one step closer to building what comes next. And that is why I laugh, because now we have the opportunity to be a part of the generation that builds whatever comes next. I love that orientation, because for many of us, and I say for myself in particular, when I look at my own rage, when I look at my own fear right now, much of it is because the world has changed. And if I'm being honest, the world is changing in ways that we always knew that it would. We always know that the nature of a country is going to change, the nature of peace and war, the nature of belonging, the nature of values and laws. These things are ever changing. And yet, if we look out into our lives, for many of us, we are constantly upended anytime we encounter those changes. I recall speaking to a member of my community a few weeks ago who was walking around here in the Upper West Side, and they noticed that a new restaurant had popped up in place of one that they had known for many years. And they were really angry about it. Now, being here on the Upper West Side, you know that there are restaurants that seem to rotate every single day through here, and yet it doesn't stop us from being upset when the place that we care about is different. When even if we never walked into that restaurant, even if it was the restaurant we would never step foot in, the fact that it's different makes us upset. And if we look around, we see that those changes are almost always difficult for us. We want to feel a sense of security and stability in our world. And yet, what I like about this story of Rabbi Akiva is he reminds us that in all of the pain of change, also is the opportunity to be a part of what comes next. And that is, I think, an important mentality as I think about Jewish tools of hope. It is easy to tell the story of Judaism as one persecution after the next. And some of us who have either ourselves are Jewish or connected people are Jewish will know that one of the classic Jewish ways of telling about every one of our holidays is they tried to kill us, we survived, and now let's eat. Okay, that's the classic way of summarizing every holiday in Judaism. Really, truly, if you go and look at almost every holiday, it's basically we are on the brink of annihilation. Somehow, through miracle or human tenacity, we survived, and now let's have a party about it. But we're going to keep remembering that there's going to be another annihilation, another destruction. There's going to be shadow and death over and over and over again. And often the way that the story ends up being told is a story that says that we are always going to be on the brink of it all. We are always going to be just one step away from annihilation. And that is one way to tell the story. And we could look at many other faith traditions, many other ethnicities, and see we could tell the story of persecution and suffering. But there's another grand story to be told. So before, earlier this morning, I was sharing with Diane that this is a time when almost everything in my world seems to be filtered through the war between Israel and Hamas. That even though I'm not Israeli, and even though I'm living here in the Upper West Side, the fact that I'm Jewish inherently seems to bring me into this conflict taking place half a world away. And what's interesting is I'm seeing it connected to this war, everyone's motivation is to try to discern whose fault is it. Is it Hamas's fault for the massacre on October 7th? Is it Israel's fault for occupation or for the nature of having occupied Gaza up until 2005? Is it the IDF's fault? Is it Palestinians' fault? Is it America's fault? Is it the British fault? Whose fault is it really? And this interesting instinct to try to go back and discern who started it off, who created the first injustice, who created the first harm. And our obsession over trying to find the first harm means that we actually lose sight of the much more important story, which is, where is the first redemption going to take place? Who is the first person willing to imagine a different path? Because the fallacy of the first harm is that there is no end to that road. That there is always another person to blame, always another experience to point a finger at, always another atrocity that precedes it. We can go back and try to measure who is the most indigenous people there in the land. Jews, Muslims, is it Arabs? I mean, where are we going to go back? Are we going to measure it by hundreds of years, thousands of years? Are we going to note the fact that Judaism actually started outside of that land? Actually in the land of Egypt? Are we going to note that Islam started outside of that land? Are we going to note that Christianity actually started inside that land but actually bloomed and rose to power outside that land? Where are we going to go and find the real origin story here? Who has the greatest right to the land? Are we going to go and look and see who has suffered the most? Is it Palestinians? Is it Jews? Is it Israelis? Is it Druze? Who suffered the most? There's no end to those roads of thinking. But what if we shifted our attention for a moment and thought about this story, a story of hope, which is who's going to be the first person to choose a different path, to instead of perpetuate the wound, perpetuate the harm, say that because you did this to me, I am justified in doing this to you, to suggest, despite the fact that you did this to me, I believe that you have a place in this world. That despite the harm I have felt, I believe that I have to be tied to you if we're going to build a palace. And it brings me back to an interesting story that I've been thinking a great deal about this year. And this is the story of the Exodus. In the Jewish tradition, one of the great holidays is the holiday of Passover, where we have a banquet and use food to tell the story of the ancient Israelites being enslaved in Egypt for hundreds of years and finally finding redemption. In that story, Pharaoh becomes afraid. The Pharaoh, the god king of Egypt, is afraid of the ancient Hebrews. They're multiplying. They seem to find prosperity and power, and decides that he's going to decimate all of the young boys of the Hebrews. And one of those boys ends up being saved, ends up being Moses, the hero of the story. His mother places him in a basket and lets him float down the Nile. And Pharaoh's daughter sees this foreign baby floating in the water, and she decides to take him out of the water, hold him in her arms, and raise him as her own. The early rabbis 2,000 years ago see that one act is so great that they give this unnamed daughter of Pharaoh a name. They name her Batya, the daughter of God. And they imagine that so righteous was that one act of offering care to a stranger, of binding her ship to his, that they actually believe that she never dies, but she has achieved a almost saintly status of a person that is eternally living and descends to offer redemption at the times that they are most needed. And what I love about this idea of Batya, this idea of the foreigner, the daughter of the enemy God king, being the one who brings redemption. It is the lesson to us of what gives us hope in the world. It is not just sticking with our own people, our own community. It is that we are measured towards hope and a better future to the degree we are willing to look into the face of another, even the face of our enemy, and to believe that we should take that face into our arms and make sure that they know that we are bound together. I think for a moment about the tools of hope. The national anthem for Israel is called Hatikva, the hope. And while Israel, joining many other nations around the world, may be a nation that is complex, may be flawed like this one is and many others are, it is interesting to have a national anthem that is about aspiration and hope. It is to suggest, actually, that our days are here to move us forward. But again, going back to the image of the bound ships, the only way that we build a palace out of this world is if we are willing to do it together, bound together. And so this brings me full circle, and then I'll wind down to make sure I've got plenty of time for some Q&A here, is that some of the times of fracture are most measured not by all that comes apart, but by in the things that come apart, the new land, the space that is created for new opportunity. We can go and imagine Rabbi Akiva laughing at the walls that have come down, and imagine for a moment what it is to dream of the new things that we will build. So if we are half divine, if in our ability to make choices we are godly, if in the potency that comes when we are woven together and engaged in a building project together, if in binding our ships together we come to the only place where we can actually build this greater palace, then we look at the tools that actually give us an awareness of this, but also the vibrancy, the vitality to engage in it. We start with gratitude. We end with hope. And in one of the final prayers that we do in every Jewish prayer service, we offer this idea. Bayom hahu, yeh Adonai echad u'shmo echad. One day, when we have woven ourselves together in this grand building project, then the name of God will be one, and God will be one. What's interesting about this, and the interesting about ending every Jewish prayer service this way, is that earlier in the prayer service, we give the most famous of Jewish prayers called the Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Pay attention, Israel. God is one. Earlier in the prayer service, we say, God is one. That's how it is. We end the prayer service saying, God's not one yet. Once we are woven together, once we have figured out how to tether our ships together, once we have figured out how to build together and work together, then God's name will be one and God will be one. And what I love about this is it means that when we conclude our prayer services and walk out into the world, we are being told that our choices are what will determine whether or not divinity is united, whether the language around divinity is connected or not. And that to me is the most important tool at a time of fracture, is that my natural instincts, when the world gets scary, is to batten down the hatches, to retreat back under the covers, to go and look at my tiny little world that's 2 inches around me, and to just stay there for a second, to go do the ostrich thing of the head in the sand. And it's interesting because these are tools that are meant to go exactly counter to that. To say that if I want to believe that my prayers matter, my prayer has to turn into behavior. That if I want actually to have my grandchildren tell the story of a better world, it means I have to choose the story that moves us towards that better world. And that ultimately, if every person's reaction to a time of fear and fracture is to retreat, to withdraw, to isolate, then there is no chance for us to build a palace. It is only in those who are willing to dare in the face of fear in the face of all that's coming down, to laugh and to remind each other, we have blessing right now. We have opportunity right now. There is an incredible building project that we can engage in right now. And despite all the things that seem to tear us apart, imagine what we could do if we were willing to reach out our hands and to shape something together. So, at a time of fear, I wake up every day and offer gratitude for that day, even if I have no idea what the purpose of the day is yet. But my hope is that every time I bump into a person, or I encounter a leaf on the street, or I open my eyes to some new aspect of humanity, I might find the reason why I'm there that day. And it also means I walk through my day encountering the face of every person, believing that they are here for a reason, that they have been given a reason for being here, and wondering if in that interaction we both might come away realizing that part of that purpose was seeing two ships that had been disconnected that can come away being tied together. Ship by ship, person by person, blessing by blessing, lowly leaf by lowly leaf is how we slowly build a palace of a better world. So I want to stop there, offer comments, would welcome questions. If you don't have any, I'll keep talking, but I want to make sure we have time for that. Please.
We need to find you a speaking slot at United Nations. Oh, no, I've said my part.
Thank you, Rabbi, for your excellent lecture.
Of course.
My point is that in Indian philosophy and some spiritual aspects, we have seen that the god, especially the dancing god Nataraja, creating in one hand and destroying in the other hand at the same time. And similarly, in Gita, the song of God, we see that the God is saying, I'll come again and again to destroy the wicked and save the good people. So the point, what I'm saying, that's resonating with what you're saying. But what my point is that in the modern world, our values are, if we have more bank balance, we're a better man. So by hook or crook, so you get it because you want to win. And the people who don't have it, they feel they're deprived. So this mindset, in some Indian tradition, they said, unless you develop a spiritual mindset, then you will never be happy because you will never have everything. There will always be a want. And as long as there is a want, there will be frustrations, there will be failures, there will be feelings of insufficiency. So I'll say, unless we take that spiritual thought seriously and apply it in every aspect of our life, the whole this crisis of civilization, the wars that we are fighting, one country saying, I'm better than you, one group of people is saying, I'm better than you. That will not, as long as they know they're in the same boat. If one part of the boat sinks, that other part, even if it's Titanic, it will go down. As long as we don't have the understanding, change of mindset, be more, I guess, spiritual minded, if you don't, I think, so there may be a little faint ray of hope. That's all I want to say, and thank you for it.
Beautifully said, thank you. I think it's interesting because every one of us, in our families and in our friend groups, we come to see this basic truth, the one that you just articulated so well. You know, in the book of Genesis, in the first book of the Hebrew and Christian Bible, each chapter basically is going through and telling the story of humanity, and it's basically just the story of fractured families. Any of us who have had challenging families, we understand this, okay? That if you want to understand why the world is so terrible and why the world is so fraught, it's because of families. And you can see it. When we see one child favored over another, inevitably what is created by that is a sense of animosity and resentment. And that carries and cascades from one generation to the next. And even though it's so obvious, and we can see it in our own family, that if you want to create family cohesion, you need to make sure that everyone in the family feels like they have purpose in being there, that they're valued, that they're seen, that you are one shared unit. And yet we can't somehow cascade that outside our own families even. To realize that if we look out at human conflict and believe that by beating somebody down, by destroying somebody, even if it's justified in the path of war, that ultimately the long-term effect of that will simply be another generation of anger and resentment and hatred. So what breaks the cycle? It's only by sharing the blessings. It's only by helping a person believe that they are needed and necessary. And that's hard. So when we look out at a time right now where we have 24 wars taking place around the world, war is inevitable. I don't know there's ever been a time in human history where there hasn't been war. Conflict is inevitable. But the question is, are we willing to think about what's the ultimate end goal? War can't be the end goal. The end goal has to be something that allows us to feel like blessing is held and shared together. So thank you. I completely agree.
Thank you, Rabbi, for this inspiring talk this morning. I found it to be so practical, relevant, and rational. I have a couple of questions, and I'll ask one after the other. One is, could you share some of the blessings that you mentioned? I had not heard of those, but it sounds like some templates that could really help us. Even though exact words, those would be helpful for the different scenarios, like a flower, for some good news, for some bad news, for some annoying person, a few good and like not so good ones. I would find those very helpful. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you. It's interesting because the blessing formula in Judaism is a very simple formula. In Hebrew, the blessing formula is Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, which means, blessed are you, God, ruler of the universe. And then some little note here, which is just a way of saying, okay, in this moment, I want to reflect on a sense of divinity. I want to lift my mindset beyond myself for a second and acknowledge something. And one of the things that's one of the most popular ones, I would say, is Oseh Ma'aseh V'Reshit. So the one who goes and makes the works of creation. So to go and which is a kind of a generic way of saying, oh, there's some bad news that's happening in the world. Oh, okay, well, there's something that's happening in this that's meaningful. Or I see a flower that's blooming. Could I imagine that there's divinity within that act? And there's an interesting reflection. This comes from the Jerusalem Talmud, so probably written around 400 CE, which is one of the first texts dealing with Jewish prayer and blessing formulas. And these rabbis are kind of arguing and debating and saying that Jewish liturgy should never be read like a letter, meaning should not just go and just say mumble words. And one rabbi says, yes, and each day one should go and innovate and create 3 new prayers a day, 3 new blessings a day. Another one says 1 new blessing a day. And one rabbi says, and I'm petrified to do this because I'm afraid that I'm going to get it wrong. And what I love about this early reflection is nowadays, in the time of Harry Potter and things, we sometimes think about prayer as like incantation. It's like, Wingardium Leviosa, and if we don't do it right, it's not going to work. The formula in Judaism, what I love, and I think this is probably true of a lot of faith traditions, is there's a lot of repetition in those words because it's easy to remember. And then how do we create some little particular thing that grounds us in that moment? So what I would say is, I can give you some of the language, but even more important, it's what would be the thing, almost the mantra, that spools you up to feel a sense of gratitude over and over. So 100 times a day, we're theoretically supposed to say in Judaism the words, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. But if we do it in a meaningless way, if I say, blessed are you, Adonai, ruler of the universe, and I'm not aware of it, that I've missed the whole point of it. It's almost, does anyone here do yoga? Okay, great. And those of you who do yoga, do you have a yoga mat out of curiosity? Okay, great. Okay, so for many years, every once in a while I'll still do it, but I was a person who was very, very into hatha yoga for many years. And I took great pride in my yoga mat. Okay, what I love here in New York especially is the pride people take over the holders for the yoga mats. Okay, you walk around, you know what I'm talking about, okay? So what's interesting is you don't need a yoga mat to do yoga. It makes me feel a little like more clean if I'm going to be in a space that I'm not lying on somebody else's like sweat and perspiration and things, but you don't actually need the yoga mat. You don't actually even need the yoga mat holder. And sometimes what happens along the way is we think of the tool as being the essence of what we're doing. Okay, anyone here, does anyone here run? Anyone runners? Okay, great. So I also was a runner for many years. If you've ever talked to a runner, one of the things they're most proud of is their shoes. Yes. Okay? Because the shoes really matter. If you don't have the wrong shoes, you're not going to really get the right run in. But running's not about the shoes. You don't need the shoes for running. And it's similar to the blessings themselves, is we will sometimes forget that the purpose of the tools is to make things a little easier. The yoga mat gives us a little more stability and a little more cleanliness. The shoes for running help give us a little more support and a little more traction. The words help us get a little bit more close, maybe, or set us up for the gratitude. But we end up falling into the wrong place if we think it's about the words, which is just a way of saying, sure, and I can actually email some blessings if you want.
No, but basically the idea is we come across these things and we don't just mindlessly walk past them, but pause and connect ourselves to the divine and remember the divine. Exactly. Right there, right? So, and we can use our own personal mantra, our own personal deity, language, etc. Yeah.
Perfectly summarized.
Yeah. So praising the divinity, seeing the divinity's power, and thanking.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah,
and,
okay.
And
that's a wonderful concept. I didn't know about this.
And most children are wired for this. You know, I talked about my daughter here, and those of us who have children, have been children, or ever been around children, we know this. There's something that kids are tapped into that somehow we unlearn, we forget. You know, in the same way that I can roll my eyes at a kid who's having a temper tantrum because they believe that, you know, the butterfly that flew away is the greatest tragedy in the world, is also the same child that sees in that leaf divinity, that sees in that gummy bear that they're savoring over and over and over again something delicious and wondrous. And so also I think that's also just how do we reclaim a little bit of that wonder in the world?
Thank you so much. The second question I had was when Diane was talking about your research into early Jewish mysticism. Pardon my ignorance, I do not know much about it, but if you could talk a little bit, in sort of an intro, and give us a little bit about maybe the history or some events or some people or the concept of mysticism in Judaism. I would appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes, exactly. So, and maybe we'll find another time, and I'm happy to do more in-depth reflection on this. So, early Jewish mysticism, which most forms of it date back about 2,500 years or so. And it's the literature around it is called the Hechalot literature, the literature of the palaces. And many of the early rabbis and maybe proto-rabbis, before there were rabbis, imagined actually that the world that we live in is simply the surface layer. If you've ever seen The Matrix before, The Matrix is maybe the most mystical movie that has ever been created. Okay, this notion that the reality that we live in right now is actually a veil. It's a mask that hides the true reality. And in Merkava mysticism, early Jewish mysticism, they imagined that the palace of God is a chariot, and that one needs to descend beneath the surface of the lived reality to get to the inner sanctum of the world as it actually is. The image that they'll often bring is this image of a God that is almost like a princess hidden in a tower, veiled behind the tower. And it is through text, through language, through meditation, that people come to kind of pierce the veil and see beneath. And in Merkava mysticism, they believed that there were different layers that one could get to, and that each layer you would get to in the mystical realm would come with the risks of thinking that you had arrived at the essential truth. And every time a person reached a palace, a different chamber, and believed that they had reached the essential truth, that would be the moment when either they would lose their mind or they would be killed. Is the deeper that you go, the more you have to know you aren't there. If that makes sense. Yes. And so many of the early stories try to create visual expressions of this. walls of these chambers that have 1,000 eyes or are covered with mouths bearing teeth and things that are meant to kind of scare people away. But the idea behind it is everything is connected. And the deeper you go in mystical truths is the more you come to understand the unity behind it all. That's early Jewish mysticism in a nutshell.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
Thank you, Rabbi. This was one of the most relevant and wonderful talks. I thank you for that. I just want to confess that I'm an ostrich.
I'm with you.
So in this, hearing all this news of wars and all the troubled world and the leaders and etc., I thank God for the life He has given me. So it's kind of like a selfish gratitude. My question to you is, in this world of turmoil, how to be? You talked about building a palace together. How to be that? What practice would you suggest that I do as an individual, not to feel so helpless, and to just be grateful that God has given me alone a good life, but how to change that to be a voice that would help build a palace?
What a beautiful question. I'm happy to give a thought. Do you have any idea?
No.
Okay. So here's one thing that I've been trying. This is definitely a time where I feel like everything I say has the potential to be the wrong thing. It definitely feels like a time right now where every word that I say is being examined through a microscope to the point where surely someone is going to go and say, I'm doing something atrocious. And, and some of this is particularly as a person who's Jewish and feels right now like every word that I'm being, saying is being filtered through the lens of, Israeli military policy and things. What I'm finding is that sometimes it's hard to know what to say. And as a result, one of the tools that I've been trying is instead of trying to say things, to just ask questions. Because I'm realizing that at a time of isolationism and of fear, many people feel that they don't matter, that they don't have potency, that there's nothing that they can do, that they, like me, are petrified of saying the wrong thing. And so they feel silenced. And what's interesting about a question, a genuine question, authentic question, is you're opening a door, but you're also saying to another person, you have value, you have meaning. You asking me a question says, hey, Ben, there's somebody out there that's looking at you and curious what's going on in your mind. What if I took exactly that wisdom and brought that out? What if I just did that with every person? What if I made every person around me feel like their hidden world, their inner heart, their inner mind actually mattered to somebody? And it's not necessarily changing the world overnight, but even and especially with people with whom it's difficult to talk, that opens doors. So that's at least a tool I'm sitting in right now. I don't know if that's helpful. As at least it just creates this little tiny opening that says there's now something that connects us together. And a question is sometimes all it takes to remind a person that they're needed.
What's the nature of that question?
So here's a question that I've been asking actually of a lot of people these days. So one is, for many years, people were asking me the question, what keeps you awake at night, Ben? Which is just another way of saying...
What troubles you?
Yeah, what troubles you, okay? What's the source of your anxiety in life, okay? And there's a lot. There's a lot of sources. Much more interesting question, I find, is what inspires you to get out of bed in the morning? What do you hope for in life? What gives you a feeling of gratitude in life? What is your place of belonging in life? These are all really interesting questions, and all ones that nobody assumes has a single right answer, and all of them expand my own understanding. Like, my guess is we could go around the room, and if I asked each of you, what is a source of belonging in your life? My guess is we would all come away with a gift, because we would all suddenly reflect on and think of, that's interesting. I never thought about that as maybe being a source of belonging in my life. So meaning I actually think the questions are the most important tools we have right now. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. I love the analogy of tying our boats together, and I was curious, so what are your thoughts on tying your boat to another boat that doesn't want to be tied to? I'm thinking about like the son of the rabbi who had the laser eyes destroying people. It doesn't sound like he was trying to tie his boat to anyone. So what do you do in instances where you run into people who don't want to tie their boat to yours?
Such a great question. Yeah. So, and despite the fact that, of course, I know that everyone should tie their boats to mine, obviously it really only works when it's a mutual choice. And I think that's what makes it so complicated and problematic. I've been having conversations with some of my colleagues, and it's a difficult time to be rowing together. And, if we're honest, in a community, we have a lot of different perspectives. That's part of what makes us wise, is we have many different understandings and lenses on the world. And as I had mentioned, what it means is that if we're going to bind ourselves together in connection, there are going to be times where the collective movement, the collective direction, is not the way that some of those ships would want to go. And the question becomes, if the collective coerces those different ships to stay connected, then what gets bred is resentment. Then those ships who feel coerced to be held together will be doing everything they can to sever those cords. So the only way I see that it actually works is for a person, when they are feeling that dissonance with the collective, to be able to look up and say, nonetheless, if I look at the long arc, the longer story, overall, this is better for me than just moving in this moment to the direction that I want to be in. Which means I think the only way it works actually is mutual. And so when we encounter the people who want to incinerate the world, it's not going to be by us saying, sorry, you're going to be tied to me, I've got my handcuffs here. But rather instead, perhaps it's thinking about how might we open the Eliezers of the world, the ones who are burning and incinerating the world with their eyes. What is the pain behind them? What's the wound beneath that? The poet David White has this beautiful reflection on anger, where he says that anger, before it turns to rage, before it's full-out fury, that anger is a gift of vulnerability, because anger is the expression of you articulating that there is a hurt and injustice that you feel. And I love that frame because many of us are uncomfortable with the anger of others. And the reaction that we have is either to handcuff them to us and say, well, too bad, you're coming along for the ride, or to walk away because we're scared. And so I think it might be, could we be the ones who are willing to see the wound beneath the anger, the harm beneath the anger, and be willing to sit with the person in that wound, not because we can heal it, but because we can let them know they're not alone in it. And maybe that, at least, creates the opening for their own willingness to tether themselves to us. Not because we're trying to change their direction, because we're saying exactly where you are and how you're feeling is a part of the story. And I'm willing to be with you in that part.
Thanks for introduction of the tools that you mentioned. Can you recommend a book which would go into more details about some of those tools that you mentioned, and also tell about more tools?
Sure. There's a really interesting book by a rabbi. His name was Alan Lew, L-E-W. He wrote a book called This is Real and You Are Completely Unprepared. And so Rabbi Lew, he actually spent a fair amount of his life as a Buddhist and ended up coming back to Judaism and ended up becoming a rabbi. And he wrote this book just before he actually died. And this book is a bit of a memoir of his own personal spiritual journey, but he maps it onto some of the cycle of the Jewish year, some of the holidays of the Jewish year. And what's really beautiful is he brings out many of the tools that I mentioned, but from a place of how it personally affects him. So I usually read this book once a year or so. I find it very helpful and meaningful. It's not really a how-to manual, but I think that's why it's so valuable. I know some people in the room, maybe you find the how-to books really helpful. I almost never find I can just kind of pick it up and be like, okay, I'm going to go through step 1, 2, 3, check, I did it. And what's helpful about the book is it feels like it's filtered through life. It's filtered through pain, through struggle, through stumbles. So that would be my recommendation. Of course. Okay. Then I want to offer gratitude to you all for this time. And oh, yes, this is real, and you are completely unprepared. So thank you for the chance to get to be with you all. I'm so grateful to be woven together. My hope is that I'm going to find an opportunity to invite Swami Sarvapriyananda to be joining me at Roda Shalom, and certainly would invite you all to join me as well. But I really want to offer gratitude to you all. Dan, thank you so much for always opening the doors here, and a gift to be with you.
And I think everybody will join me in saying that there is a collective gratitude in this room for the fact that you were here this morning. And it was a wonderful talk, and you must come back.